Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to the program on U.S.-Japan relations. We are in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and delighted to be welcoming you. I'm Susan Pharr, and until December, I was director of the program on U.S.-Japan relations. I now serve as its senior advisor and was honored to be asked to moderate today's event. These are obviously very disturbing times with the president hospitalized with coronavirus and the world struggling still with coronavirus. We have political transitions, a new administration in Japan. In the US, we're only weeks away from a presidential election. In democracies, citizens are deeply involved in all the march of events, playing a critical role both in politics and society. The topic today is civil society and policy advocacy in contemporary East Asia. And when we talk about civil society in its broadest sense, it's a full spectrum of organized activity on the part of citizens, from business groups on the one hand to hobby groups on the other. But a critical group of a whole array of organizations and groups fall into the category of advocacy, and they're engaged in various forms of advocacy. So our panel today focuses on the phenomenon of civil society in East Asia, particularly looking at Japan, but looking at the role of civil society in policy advocacy. We are delighted to have two speakers who are eminently qualified to talk about this topic. Our first speaker will be Mary Haddad, who is at Wesleyan University, where she is the John Andrews Professor of Government. She just stepped into her named chair, and we congratulate her. She is chair of the College of East Asian Studies, and she is also director of the Office for Faculty and Career Development. She's been a great leader at Wesleyan University. Her bachelor's degree is from Amherst College, and then her MA and PhD from the University of Washington. She came to Harvard right after receiving her PhD to be an Academy Scholar, a very prestigious program at Harvard, and she was here for 2 years. And while she was at Harvard, she was very active in the program on U.S.-Japan relations. She's received an Abe Fellowship, and she has currently is with the American Political Science Review. She's now a member of its editorial board. She is the author of numerous books, including Politics and Volunteering in Japan, A Global Perspective. She has a book on building democracy in Japan. And forthcoming, she has a book called Effective Advocacy, Lessons from East Asia's Environmentalists, which will come out next year. Our second presenter is Kanoko Kamata. Her undergraduate degree is from Nihon University. She came to Harvard to be part of the Kennedy School, where she received her NPA in 2012. And during that time studied community organizing with Marshall Gans, who's really famous for his instruction at Kennedy School on community organizing. She was also with the Kennedy School's Ash Center as a research fellow, and she was an associate in the U.S.-Japan program over the period from 2017 to 2019, in which she was very active in a wide spectrum of events and worked with Mary Brenton as a research assistant and as in various joint projects. She has a forthcoming book in Japanese called Community Organizing, 5 Steps to Create the Future We Want. And I should mention that she is important in her presentation today, and in her background, she in Japan was co-founder and former executive director of an organization called Community Organizing Japan, which trains nonprofit organizations, unions, and youth in community organizing. So we'll now turn things over to our panel, and I should mention that Kamata-san is now in the sociology PhD program at the University of Pittsburgh. So Mary Alice, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Susan, for that very gracious introduction, and to Shin and Amy for all of your organizational feats in pulling this off. I am talking today about my forthcoming book called Effective Advocacy: Lessons from East Asia's Environmentalists. And I started this project actually a long time ago now. I'm going to get my time so that I don't just blabber on and on and on too long. So it was about 10 years in the making, and I started off with a pretty basic puzzle that a lot of people who study East Asia may have, which is that it doesn't have any of the things that we're used to seeing for effective advocacy, particularly effective environmental advocacy. We don't have big active green parties. You have very pro-business governments. No matter who's in charge, they're very pro-business. You have a relatively small, compared to the US-Europe advocacy sector. You don't have big green parties. So the things that brought big environmental movements and environmental policy to Europe and the United States are essentially much smaller in East Asia, and yet you find very progressive environmental policy across the region. So I went into this question of like, well, how did they do it? Clearly the advocates must be doing something right. They're operating in very hard conditions, and yet they're getting their agenda through. So I was curious to figure out what was going on. I thought it would be a good test case. And I also, having my last book was about democracy, so I was very interested in how democracy might affect what strategies advocates could use. So I thought I had this very elegant research design in which I had a mature democracy in Japan, South Korea and Taiwan were new democracies, and China is obviously not a democracy. So I wanted to test, especially to try to find what advocacy strategies were different, what were effective under these hostile conditions, and then also test my ideas that both East Asia was different and that democracies were different. So I talked to lots of different people in the government, in the advocacy sector, in business, in academia, and I found out, to my surprise, actually, that almost everybody that I talked to came up with about the same 5 things that worked. So I would ask them, what are the advocacy strategies that work? And they would say, make friends on the inside. You can imagine that this might be true if you are an NGO and you hire a former Ministry of Environment official to be on the board of directors of your NGO. That works in Bonn, it works in Beijing, it works in Seoul, it works in Buenos Aires, doesn't matter. A second really important strategy was make it work locally. So you get an idea to work in a specific time and place, and then you can scale it. So you get another, you make it work in your town, you make it work in the next town, you make it work in a few more towns, you make it work in your state, you make it work in another state, and then it becomes national policy or even can spread internationally. A third one is make it work for business. So if you're at that sweet spot where your pro-environmental policy is also money making, that's really useful no matter where you are. Education, both at the grassroots level and also at the elite level, is very effective. And one that was surprising to me was art. That is regularly used. It's not the most common strategy, but it's regularly used in all the countries that I studied. And then I have this last chapter in the book called Be a Game Changer. And this is not exactly a single strategy. It's sort of these people are so innovative that they just think outside the box and they change the landscape of advocacy for everybody else. So today, rather than focusing on particular strategies during the Q&A, if you have questions about any of them, please ask. I have lots of great stories, and the book was really fun to write, and hopefully will be fun to read for people. Lots of great stories in each of the chapters. But what I'm going to focus on is the theoretical framework that I came up with to try to figure out why these strategies. So I got this information from my interview subjects, and then I wanted to verify it with a sort of larger N sample. So I did a large N sample of event analysis using Factiva from 2005 to 2009. So these events, which were environmentally related events, were old enough so that I could sort of figure out what happened. Did the advocates get what they wanted or not? But they were new enough so that they sort of captured contemporary politics, which I was interested in. So this was I coded for a whole bunch of different things. This was the count of sort of how frequently something showed up. And as you can probably imagine, especially those who are familiar with the literature, the ones at the top are the ones that show up the most in East Asian politics literature. Work with government, work locally, network with others, do education. And the things that show up the most in environmental politics literature, which tends to have Europe and the US as its basis, lawsuits, protests, lobbying, they didn't show up so much. This was not just in East Asia. This was a worldwide sample. And so it turned out that the things that my advocates were telling me in my interviews were the most common and the most effective in East Asia turned out to be the most common and the most effective everywhere, which was sort of surprising to me. So this is just the count in terms of how frequently things showed up. And then this is how effective they were. I had a very crude measure of effectiveness, which is essentially, did the advocates get what they were trying, what they said they wanted? And so I can talk more about the methodological challenges with that, but essentially the list was not all that different than the other one. So what came out of this is two surprises. So the first one was that, contrary to almost everything I've read in the literature, East Asia is not nearly as different from the rest of the world as you might think. Advocates in East Asia operate quite similar in terms of the broad advocacy strategies. And the second surprising thing was that democracy didn't matter in the way that I thought. I had expected that I would find that in Japan and in democratic countries, you had this sort of very large range of advocacy strategies that advocates would use, and that a pretty big range of them would be effective. And that in new democracies, you might have a slightly narrower range and an even narrower range that worked. And in non-democratic countries like China, you had a super narrow range of advocacy strategies that people were able to utilize, and that a really, really narrow range worked. And that wasn't what I found. I can explain more in the Q&A if you want, but essentially what appears to be going on is that the strategies for effective advocacy, which is the focus of this book, are different. And the reasons why strategies are different are, for success, are different than failure. Sort of like the dynamics for successful economic development. It's not just the reverse of those dynamics lead to state failure. They're sort of like a different set of things that lead to state failure. And it appears to also be the case for democracy's effect on advocacy. So theoretically speaking, that why these set of strategies? What is it about making friends on the inside, educating, working locally, working for business, and art? That's like an odd configuration of strategies. And so what is it that makes them work? So for those who are familiar with policymaking models, traditional models tend to have like a team mindset in which you try to set up your team against another team. And the language that they'll often use is a multi-stakeholder analysis or a multi-stakeholder approach. And the idea here is that you have an individual advocate or this stakeholder, they have their stake and they stick it down and they fight for their stake. And to the extent that they have several things they're trying to fight for, there's a hierarchy. They know what their most important thing is, and their second most important thing, and their third most important thing, and their fourth, et cetera, et cetera. And when you get into the policy dynamics, you often end up, in terms of the policymakers in the room, you'll have a stakeholders configuration. One of the really great theoretical models for this is called the Advocacy Coalition Framework. And this is the idea that coalition of like-minded advocates that have sort of similar belief structures and want the same thing work together in networks to try to promote their causes. But it's still the idea where you have a side and a stake and an issue and a perspective, and you're fighting for those things against another set of people that have different ideas. And from these models, the way that you improve policy and get good policy in the end is to have multiple stakeholders. So you get everybody who might care about the policy in the room, or sort of have a representative, and then they all hash it all out. And then you end up with some sort of compromised setup, compromised policy that everybody can live with, even if nobody really likes it that much. So the confusion that I had, or the problem that I had with this, there are sort of a number of different ones, but the one that hit me right away when I was doing my interviewing was that this multi-stakeholder perspective on policy suggests that the policymakers have a single institutionally determined goal that they want to get, right? They know what policy they want, and they have that, and they're the stakeholder, and they have this one goal that they want. But the policymakers that I spoke with and the policy influencers that I spoke with very rarely had a single perspective. To use the sort of colloquial expression, Americans, they wore multiple hats. So, for example, they might be, and this is a hypothetical person, but somebody like this, they might be a professor at Keio University who is a technical specialist and is brought into policy advisory committee because of their technical expertise on soil remediation and sort of like levels of toxicity in the soil. But they also sit on the board of an NGO that's trying to promote better environmental soil protections and eradicate pollution. But they also are on a new startup biotech company that is involved in these new things that are eating the soil in ways that clean them up. And their wife might be part of a chemical company that does something different altogether. And then they also sit on the government committees regularly. So these people are not like a member of the NGO or a non-political academic perspective or business or government. They are all of those perspectives in a single person. And most of the people that I met with that were sought after policymakers had profiles that were similar to that. They were not individual stakeholders pushing a single agenda. They were sort of very highly connected people who had a broad perspective and multiple agendas that they were interested in pursuing. So I tried to come up with a way of conceptualizing this and thinking about it. And so the language that I use is called the connected stakeholder model. So the emphasis here is not on an individual stakeholder who's represented, but rather on the networks of stakeholders that are connected to the policymaking process. And so the big shift here in terms of orientation, theoretical orientation, is rather than an advocate who has a single issue, who plays on a team, who's fighting for their cause and they want to win, the shift is much more of a configuration of people who are all connected to multiple perspectives, who work with each other to try to come up with good outcomes. And in contrast to the pluralist models, the policy does improve with more stakeholders being connected. That part is consistent. But the big things that matter are more networks represented in the policymaking process and the diversity of those networks. So to the extent that policymaking about the environment doesn't just talk to the crunchy NGO environmental community, but also connects in with business, or doesn't just talk to the energy community, but also connects in with the NGOs. So why is this kind of policymaking effective? Why is network advocacy effective? Why does it work? And I sort of come up with three main overview ideas for why it works. Primary one is that it's information sharing. the policymakers have a lot more information coming in, not just from their one stakeholder or their two stakeholders that are coming in, but all these networked people are coming in. So that information sharing happens in terms of policy development and also policy implementation. It is a mechanism and system that works to empower allies. So NGOs can empower their allies in government, government can empower allies in business and NGO, and it can work in a positive sum method in which successful policy generates good results, generates good press for everybody, generates more successful policy, generates more collaborative relationships. And then finally, this method of engaging in policy helps to engage a lot of citizens. So all of these networks reach out and they engage separate and different kinds of citizens in the policymaking process and in generating how the policy works out. So thanks so much, and I'll turn it over to Kanoko.
Can everybody see my screen? Good, thank you. Okay, I also want to start my clock. I don't go over time. Okay. Hi, my name is Kanoko Kamata. Thank you very much for kind introduction, Susan. And thank you, Shane and Amy, Emma, Sophie for coordinating this event. It's my honor to come back virtually to US Japan seminar and share my work. So today I'm going to introduce my popular book written in Japanese. The title is Community Organizing, 5 Steps to Create the Future We Want. So this is the cover of my book, and in Japanese, Community Organizing, 欲しい未来をみんなで作る5つのステップ. So it will be published from Age Press early November, and target audience is the people who are frustrated by the current situation, but don't know what to do. I wrote the most of manuscripts when I was at US Japan program in 2018. So my motivation to write this book is that many people in Japan feel outraged by the status quo, but they feel helpless. So the word can't be helped is the commonly used. And so I want to communicate can help. So in introduction, I discussed why people in Japan hesitate to involve in social or political actions. It has not been the case historically. So I draw historical examples such as Ikki, peasant rebellion. Also, I argue in the democratic country, it is legitimate to speak up and talk about politics and what historical social factors made people hesitate to do so. I also argue that with effective ways to take action, we are more likely to change something. Even if we fail, we could create a base to aim for next change. From chapter 1 to 6, I introduced community organizing based on Marshall Gans at Kennedy School's framework and adaptation in Japanese context. So many of our colleagues, especially who work in rural areas, struggle to convey the organizing concept and framework to their peers because the concept is imported from the US. But concept works universally and I'm not really American stuff. And I also believe that people in any age can take action. So I developed a fictional but possible story. The adult community organizer teach the concept of organizing to 5th graders. The 5th graders facing a challenge. The new vice principal abolished the free lunchtime break. So the 5th graders learned how to organize students, build a team, make strategy, and take action in order to take back their free lunchtime break. From chapter 7 to 9, I introduced real examples. In chapter 7, I talked about literacy development campaign in Jordan and Moms' Rights campaign in Serbia. They also learned organizing at Harvard and went back to their countries and making social change. In chapter 8, I want to encourage people to think about changing something small around you. So Community Organizing Japan, which I involved as a board member, coached this campaign. The first case, a salaryman in Tokyo, father of 2 children, learned organizing applied to launching Dad's Association in order to build relationship and collaboration among fathers of elementary school students. Second case is that a community organizer, 20-year-old in small town of Iwate, and these young people took action to change the coming of age ceremony through advocating to small local government of Iwate. Third case is that midwife organized mothers to launch a postnatal care center in Iwate, where gender inequality is worse than cities. In chapter 9, lastly, I introduced a political campaign in order to tell people we can influence policy nominally in nominally democratic country. For today's panel, I thought that it would be useful to talk in detail about this case, as it can provide some comparative perspective Mary Alice's work. But if you have any questions on the book, please ask me in the Q&A. So reform of Japan's sex crime law in 2017. The background, that there was no reform of sex crimes since 1907. Activists and scholars addressed the problem, but women's movement have never addressed the campaign to reform the bill. The original law was made to protect women as a property of husband or father, so men cannot be a victim. Definition of rape is very narrow. Age of consent is 13. But there was an opportunity. Revision was discussed in the government. However, there were low interest among politicians and significant loopholes in the bill. So outcome achieved by the campaign is that the reform of sex law passed in the Diet. Diet is the National Congress in Japan. It's passed on June 2017, revised after 110 years. Main revisions are men can be victims, abuse from parents, no need to prove violence and threat until 18 years old. And loopholes addressed as the campaign demanded. The campaign successfully included imposing training for judicial officials on sexual violence. The robust sexual violence survey was also imposed, which has never conducted in Japan. A review of the reform in 3 years is mandated. That's also a big deal. And this year, 2020, the review is currently ongoing. So we hope to revise the criminal law further. We also campaigning it currently. So why the movement was successful? The campaign did both insider, which is lobbying, outsider, community organizing, movement building strategy. For lobbying, the leadership understands an opaque legislative process and finding an agenda setter. For mobilizing strategy, as you may be aware, participating protest is not really common in modern Japan. Also, there was a strong stigma to protest being scary, militant, opinionated. Social movement scholar Charles Tilly proposed the concept of contentious repertoire. He found that ordinary people do the same form of collective action repeatedly. They never engage in a form of collective action which people never have experienced. But the campaign was able to mobilize people by creating a new contentious repertoire, which is unconfrontational but contentious. The campaign to reform sex crime is called Believe Campaign, active from September 2016 to June 2017, and was composed of 4 organizations. I was one of the co-leaders in the campaign. I launched Chabujo in 2015 to organize and encourage women to speak up gender inequality. Tomorrow Girls Troops, an artist group, was also launched in 2015 and then produced art to address gender inequality. Survivors Group on Sex Crime Laws also started in 2015. Happy Tears started in 2009 and worked on raising awareness on sexual violence. So here's a timeline. In September 2014, Working Group for Sex Crime Law Reform was launched by the Ministry of Justice. So in November 2015, the Legislative Council was initiated followed by the Working Group, and Survivors Group on Sex Crime Laws lobbied Ministry of Justice, but the group found little effect on lobbying. At that time, Chabujo and Tomorrow Girls troops know nothing about sex crimes law reform, but Happy Tears hosted a sexual violence seminar to educate around that issue. Both organizations were outraged by current reform. In September 2016, Minister of Justice received a report from the Legislative Council, but he said when the reform bill will be submitted to the Diet was undecided. Urged by this lack of urgency, 4 organizations decided to launch the campaign. So the strategy was twofold. First was lobbying. The campaign member has never experienced lobbying, and then they have limited connection with politicians. But using the existing network, they approached the politicians, targeted the ones in Justice Committee in charge of sex crime reform. The lines means connection and who introduced who. So Japanese policy making is not transparent, and bill is usually drafted by bureaucrats and discussed within the majority party internally. When the bill is submitted to the Diet, 95% of contents are fixed. Ordinary people don't know the process, so we ask the politicians every time about the process. Also, the campaign tried to identify who makes decision, but was very ambiguous, as you may expect. But finally, the campaign identified an agenda setter, Ryosei Akazawa, Liberal Democratic Party, at the upper right corner in this chart. He was a Deputy Diet Affairs Committee Chairman in Justice Committee who is able to control agenda in the committee as well as Diet. Akazawa seemed to resonate with Survivor's story, but he had an interest in the campaign because he wanted to gain support from women from his superior, Shigeru Ishiba, who aimed to challenge Prime Minister Abe. So the campaign leaders knew that only insider strategy lobbying is not enough to pressure a personal legal change. Many people need to raise voices in order to pressure the politicians, which is outside the strategy. However, people never talked about sexual violence. So the campaign, it's also before the Me Too movement. So the campaign tried to educate what is sexual violence and developed cartoons make accessible for ordinary people. Campaign also did the online mobilization. Over 54,000 people signed petition, and then many shared their own experience of sexual violence. Online mobilization is somewhat successful, but we needed to have in-person mobilization in order to create our base. However, protest is not contentious repertoire in Japan. But we know the people in Japan like learning new things. So in Japan, sexual consent has never been taught. So the campaign developed a consent workshop based on British one, and they recruited people through the workshop and asked them to hold workshop in their community. At that time, sexual assault on campus became a huge problem. We recruited the committed students from several universities such as Tokyo University, Keio, Soka University, and asked them to form a team to host the current consent workshop by themselves. So this is the picture when the campaign had the consent workshop at the Diet building with college students. Toward the end of the Diet season, which ends June, always in the year, the campaign needed to increase the public opinion and to demand reform. But in Japan, as I mentioned, street demonstration is not familiar with people. Campaign also want to make it more fun to join, so they initiated the dance project. And the campaign was covered significantly by media. 47 articles were published and campaign leaders made appearance on TV. The media reported survivors' experience on demand, as well as college students' activities to prevent sexual violence and educate around sexual consent. So almost all people, politicians, scholars thought it is not possible to pass the sex crime reform in that diet season, 2017. Because very controversial anti-terrorist law took long hours for discussion. Also, Prime Minister Abe had scandals to favor his friends to build a school. Despite such political turmoil, at the end of the May, campaign organized last public event. Over 100 people came and the event was streamed online, which is first experience on related to sexual violence event. And also celebrity joined. So right after the event, a few women outside the campaign spoke about their experience of assaults, and over 30,000 people signed the petition in the last weeks of the campaign. So meanwhile, Akazawa, agenda setter, coordinated internally how to squeeze in sex crime reform in this diet season. Also, the campaign proposed to concrete supplemental resolutions with the support of politicians and submitted all parties. Finally, the campaign submitted the petitions to Minister of Justice. At that time, bipartisan politicians participated to support the campaign. And we danced together when we submit the petitions. And so this means equal relationship, and this means love is important for love is important. And 10 days after this event, sex crime law was passed in the diet. So to conclude, the book aims to inspire people to take actions for social change. And I want that book to be true for organizers, activists, to motivate and recruit people to join their campaigns. So through my PhD program, I'd like to pursue how academic resources can be useful to motivate people participating in politics and social movements. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to thank our presenters for really fascinating presentations. And I appreciated the comments some of you made on chat, raising questions and illustrating techniques today used by community organizers. Using social media, they can raise questions in a way that was never possible before. So let's open it up. But before that, I wonder if I could start out, and I'd like to pick up with Kamata-san, because you studied community organizing at the Kennedy School with a very well-known community organizing instructor who was with us today. And then you've been a practitioner in Japan of those methods. From your standpoint, what is the biggest difference for Japan in community organizing? And I know that you could point out maybe that you might mention negative things, but also any sort of strengths of Japan in terms of being able to organize in Japan. For example, are people more amenable to working as a team in the way that you need to do with community organizing? So that's my question for Kamata-san. And I would be interested, Mary Alice and Haddad, in asking you just a quick question about how social media have changed these fundamentals that you mentioned for how to engage in advocacy. And I wonder if particularly, for example, you mentioned a key point for advocacy is finding ways to reach out, to work with business. But in a way, organizing the social media have lowered the costs of advertising. You no longer have to rent a big space. You no longer have to provide meals to people. So has that reduced the reliance on business? Okay, so start, if we could, with...
Oh, Susan, is it okay? You know, we have the first question as well from Nagase-san. So
Absolutely.
I just want to get his question, if that's all right. So Nagase-san,
Absolutely.
if I could ask you to unmute your microphone for your question. Go ahead, Amazon. Yes.
Okay, yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you for having an excellent question to us. My name is Ryosuke Nagase. I'm associate in U.S.-Japan relations, and I work for the Ministry of Justice in Japan. I have several years experience working in the prison reentry field, and I agree with the concept of CSM has various kinds of benefits, such as sharing important information among stakeholders and encouraging citizens to be engaged in the social issues and making advocacy effective. But however, from my experience, I tend to have, the stakeholders tend to have a connection only with government, at least in the criminal justice system in Japan. I think to maximize the benefit of networking, it is important to incentivize stakeholders to be connected with each other. So would you tell us more about what's the difficulty for stakeholders to be connected with each other, and what makes networking successful? It's kind of related to the Susan's question. Thank you very much.
So shall we start with Kamata-san?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Susan. So I got you particularly want to know the strengths in Japan in terms of community organizing. And then, so when I brought the community organizing practice to Japan, I really fascinated by the hunger of people who wants to learn organizing. And people actually pay like $400 or $500 to come to our workshop, which is not individually, so which is not really the case in other countries. So I think what I gather from that experience is that people really miss the community, and people they don't think that they don't belong to the community. They want to create the community based on the values, not based on some small narrow interest, but more like connecting with through the values. And I also one of the strengths, but kind of also challenges that when we devise a strategy, people hesitate to do the power over, like challenging the authority, challenging the power figure is really frightening for Japanese people. But I think that the concept of power with, so we can collaborate and make something new, is also really fast resonate with Japanese people. So people start from power with, and then feeling they're building power, and they can move on to power over. But also I think that how to create strategy in power over is different from the US. Maybe in the US, the protest and attacking and challenging authority is more like common sense. But I think in Japan, not really common. So I think we try to be careful that when we frame it in a way people can resonate, I think it works.
And how about Nagase-san's question?
Oh, I thought that's what the Maria's question, so I didn't really, yeah.
Okay, so yeah. Go ahead, Mary Alice.
Thanks for those great questions. So I'll start with Susan's on social media. So social media is really interesting because, like you've said, it really reduces the barriers of communication, both across networks horizontally and also vertically, because what you can have are relatively small actors. The way that it shows up the most in the project that I just finished is with artists that produce video material that goes viral, so that they are able to impact not just through a direct policy maker through this sort of like organized structure, but they, you know, all of a sudden hundreds of millions of people see their video, not just other communities or individuals, but also the policymakers themselves. One of the great examples of this was the Chinese movie Under the Dome that was talking about pollution in Beijing, and it hit like as many people as there are in the United States saw that movie in its first 3 days before it was taken down in China. So social media can have this catalytic effect in terms of getting the word out and drawing attention. I think that it has less of a influence. I guess it also helps networks sort of stay together over time. So I don't necessarily think that it changes the dynamic of the network itself in terms of the way that it influences policy, but it does sort of catalyze certain parts of the network and allows for smaller power people. So people who might not show up as a policymaker or might not have any power, it allows them to influence the whole matrix system. So the second, Nagase's question is a really, really good one. So it is hard for these community level organizations all over the world, but especially in East Asia, because most of them are all volunteer run and have no staff. So you end up with people who are just trying to push an agenda forward in some kind of way to try to make their communities better, but they have to do it on top of running a family or having a job or both of those things. In my first book project on volunteering, I actually found that the government can have a really useful role by paying a staff person to act as a coordinator. So like the Japanese have these great organizations called Shakai Kyogikai, so they're social welfare organizations, and they often act as coordinating points. And it is common for a local government to pay a volunteer coordinator. And with that one staff position, all of the nonprofit organizations in the city can get volunteers help, because individuals that want to volunteer for something call up this, say, oh, I really want to help, little kids. And they're like, oh, well, here's 4 organizations that need help with little kids. Oh, I want to help with old people. Oh, here's 4. So that coordinating mechanism is quite hard. There are civil society organizations, and organizations can, and social media does help with this. And not necessarily social media, but just even having the internet has allowed more local to local connections. And the thing that I saw as one of the most useful was that it gave local community groups access to national and international resources. So for your area of criminal justice, if you had a small group in some town that was interested in a particular issue related to criminal justice, through the good websites of international global organizations like Amnesty and others, they could actually find out what the international legal structure is, what kinds of other resources are available for them, which would ordinarily take them, gazillion hours to research themselves, and they can't figure it out on their own. But because of the internet technology and the social media, they're able to connect to each other a lot more easily. So
Mary Alice,
Yep.
I just want to make sure we're almost at the end of our time. Let's just be sure we have it. How don't we call on Hillary Hobrow and then Keiko Kawabe-san to each ask a question, and then we'll ask each of you to very quickly reply to one part of it. So.
Thanks, Susan. Great talk, everyone. I have a question for Mary Alice, particularly about the large N data set that you developed. In these types of projects, I think it could be really difficult to see what happened with advocacy efforts that failed. So I think it's very exciting that you found a way to incorporate those into your data set. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what those failed advocacy efforts look like, and also just the question of the fact that probably a failed advocacy effort would be less likely to get into the Factiva database that you were using, and how you think about how that may have affected the data structure.
Shen was reminding me, since we'll come back to it, forgive me, Kawabe-san, but we wanted to make sure, because Marshall Gans is present with us, to give Marshall a chance to say something. So Marshall, sorry, well, may we call on you? Unmute. You have to unmute, Marshall.
No, I said, thank you, Susan, and Kamata-san, omedetou gozaimasu. It's good to see the progress that you're making on your work. My question really was for Mary Alice about boundary conditions and whether I guess the question I would pose is, where does power figure into this? And what's the difference between trying to exercise influence within a system as opposed to changing the system? And where the challenges are systemic or structural challenges, particularly that have to do with economic power, is that a different ballgame than what's described here, which seems to be operating much more within? How do you exercise influence within? So that's my question.
Okay, and we'll now also hear Kawabe-san, and then we'll give you a chance to speak. So Kawabe-san.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to Mary Alice and Kanoko-san for these great presentations. My question is for Mary Alice. I'm wondering whether or not you looked at rates of success of strategies and other types of activism. Are there lessons for people working on other issues such as police reform, or especially given the protest had low rates of success, or do you think the rates of success are unique to environmental activism?
We'll keep this very short. What do you think, Shen? Should we take any other questions? We want to be sure to give someone a chance to ask a question. Anyone else? I think we're covered. All right. So Mary Alice.
Okay, so I got a bunch really good ones. I'm going to start with the ones I can sort of check off really fast, which is almost in reverse order. So the first one, or the last one, I guess, in terms of looking at different issue areas, I did not for this study. I needed to control because there's too many confounding variables, but I suspect actually that it works pretty much the same across the issue areas. I think there's some that may work a little bit more, like there's, well, I think it might have slightly different configurations in different issue areas, but I don't really think so. I suspect that it works in other issue areas, and I'd love to follow up with you if you are interested in finding out more about the criminal justice in particular. In terms of the failed cases, there were a lot of different failed cases. Most cases succeeded, which surprised me. And it was not just an artifact of the data, because what I would do is it would show up on my data set, and it wasn't necessarily at the end. So like you get the thing that was going on, and often there would be articles later, articles before I had to sort of verify it. And so actually advocacy works most of the time, which was surprising to me and encouraging actually. But the failed cases, that's where democracy really matters. So if you fail in Japan, you like go home and have a beer with your friends, and you go back the next day and you fight some more. If you fail in Taiwan and South Korea, you go home and you have a beer with your friends, and maybe you're on a government blacklist, maybe it's a little bit harder for you to do stuff, but you're still mostly okay. And if you fail in China, you might disappear or be killed, or you may not be coming back another day. So the consequence of the failure is really different across the democracies. But the causes of the failure, I didn't have enough failure to figure out why people failed. So that's my answer to that. Marshall, your question is a really deep one and very profound. So there are a couple ways that I get at power. One of the things that I like about my model is that it does not only include high power people in the policymaking structure. It's designed to allow for the possibility of people who may not have a seat at the table or may not appear to be powerful because they're connected in through other networks. You in the chat, you linked that to business also, sort of like, do you have to be allied with business? So the strategies that I lay out are not necessary strategies. So it's not the case that you have to have them all in order to succeed. This is just recurring strategies that often worked. And in terms of business in particular, there are often businesses that are allies that you might not recognize. And also there are people inside businesses that where the whole business appears to be an enemy, but they've got allies inside the business. So for example, there are large contingents of pro-environmental people inside petroleum companies and energy companies. And there are startup eco-tech companies that are pro-environmental, even though all the other companies might not be. And so I guess to the big question of, is this advocacy model fundamentally one that requires modification and incremental change while accepting the current power structure? Or can it actually create systemic power structure change? I would suggest that it does or can create fundamental power structure change, because you can change the configuration of people who are in the process and enhance the allied structures of those who weren't really connected. And now you got more of them that are linked in. And I actually have a lot of examples of exactly that.
Well, I'm sorry to say that we're at the end of our time. I'd like to say what a privilege it has been to welcome Kamata-san and Mary Alice Haddad back to Harvard. Thank you all for coming today. Look forward to seeing you in future seminars.
Thank you.
Thank you.